very much for coming in this beautiful afternoon. We so deserve this weather.
Closer to the microphone.
Sorry. Since 2008, George Baker has portrayed the character of President John Adams in a one-man show throughout the country at national conventions and venues like Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, the presidential libraries of Dwight D. Eisenhower, George H.W. Bush, and Harry S. Truman, the New York Historical Society, and was featured as John Adams on National Public Radio's weekend program, Studio 360. A graduate of Columbia College and Columbia Law School, George has practiced law in Connecticut from 1973 to 2024. John Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts in 1735. He practiced law in Boston, where he represented 14 British soldiers charged with murder in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. In 1774, he was chosen to be one of 5 delegates from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. In 1776, he was a strenuous advocate with Thomas Jefferson for American independence from Great Britain. Later, he served as ambassador from the Continental Congress to France, Holland, and America, in England, and was vice president in the administration of President George Washington. In 1796, he was elected the second president of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President John Adams.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, my glasses. I was the 5th generation of Adamses to live in Massachusetts. My grandfather's grandfather emigrated from England in the 1640s. And when he came over here, he had 89 grandchildren. Imagine the Christmas present. So when someone whose last name is Adams comes up to me and says, "President Adams, do you think we're related?" I say, "Of course." No. My father was a simple farmer in Braintree, Massachusetts. And he was not college educated, and my mother could not read. And so people who think that the Adams had a long history of intellectuals, totally wrong, you know. But when I was 16 years old, my father decided to sell several acres of his farm, and he used the money to pay my tuition so that I could attend the local community college called Harvard. And my father wanted me to become a minister. Indeed, most of my college class went on to become clergymen. But when I graduated, I told my father that I wanted to become a lawyer, which was a profession considered several tiers below that of a minister, even then. And my father and I had a huge argument about this career choice. My father said, "I spent all that money to go to Harvard, and now you want to be a lawyer?" And we finally compromised that I would teach school for 2 years while I decided what profession I wanted and whether I would become a lawyer or not. And, initially I thought that teaching school would be a complete waste of time. But I discovered later that it was through teaching that I learned the most important skill that I was able to use for the rest of my career. And that is teaching taught me how to be persuasive. Because if you can persuade a 13-year-old to do the right thing, you can persuade anybody to do the right thing, including a Continental Congress sitting in Philadelphia 20 years later. So after 2 years of teaching school, much to my father's disappointment, I started reading the law with an attorney in Worcester. And that's how someone became a member of the bar in the colony of Massachusetts. That was the education. You read with an attorney. And after several years, I moved my growing practice to my home. After several years, I started my own practice, and I just had my own house, and that was the office. But after several years, I moved my growing practice to Boston, which was a big city then with a population, wait for it, 15,000 people. That's what went for big cities in colonial America. No, although there were no census at the time, the thought was that colonial America had about 3.5 million to 4 million people. And the most populated city was Philadelphia, that had about 45,000 people. Now, a group that I spoke 2 months ago in Boston, you know what they told me? They told me that now Boston has a population of 15,000 lawyers. But luckily not while I was there. You know, early in my career as a lawyer, and indeed growing up, I was proud to be an Englishman. I was proud of the English culture, its literature, its laws, its forms of government, and especially its beautiful language. And to be patriotic meant to be loyal to the King of England, and that was George III. And we started every important meeting like the one we have right now. If this was the 1750s, we would have started the meeting by singing the song to show our devotion to the King, and the song, of course, was God Save the King. And I remember singing it with such gusto and commitment. And you know that song, don't you? Let me play you a few bars of it just to remind you. So it's 1750, and this is what you would be singing to. God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save our King, make him victorious, happy and glorious, to reign over us. God save our King. Hey! As far as the national anthem goes, that beats almost every. Not almost. And I remember again singing that song with such gusto and commitment when I was a school teacher in Worcester, Massachusetts. You know, I taught school for 2 years, and And I remember at that time there was a regiment of British soldiers that were marching north through Massachusetts on their way to Canada to fight the French in the French and Indian War. And so when we heard about this, we got all sorts of treats and things that they could put into their duffel bag and things like that. And we all went down, and by their campfire, we sang that song, God Save the King. Oh. And I remember the devotion that I had for it. But there came a time when hardly anyone wanted to sing that song anymore. And for most of us, the king was probably the last person we would have wanted God to save. So what went so desperately wrong in that relationship between England and the American colonies? You know, I've often said that the War for Independence began in 1775, but the American Revolution began 15 years before in the hearts and the minds of the colonists. And you see, it was the French and Indian War which really started everything, because after the British victory over the French in 1763, there was a huge debt that England had to pay for its war expenses. And England said they had a financial crisis. And we in the colonies said, well, you might have had a financial crisis, but you won Canada. Isn't that a pretty good prize? And he said, no, we need taxes from the colonies in order to pay our war debts. And the Americans objected, because we in places like New York and Boston and Charleston were never asked or got the consent of the government in London to tax us. And we had no representatives of the colonies in London. There were no representatives of us in the House of Commons. We said this was totally unfair, particularly to tax us, and we had a slogan, no taxation without representation. That's a pretty good slogan. It sounds like something that would come out of Madison Avenue, you know, recently. No taxation without representation. That's the way people put it. But this conflict escalated year after year and was most pronounced in my hometown of Boston. Taxes were increased, and the colonial reaction was more and more vociferous, followed by English soldiers being garrisoned in various parts of the colonies to control the population. And this led to the worst incident in anyone's memory, the Boston Massacre of March 1770. When 14 British soldiers, one evening, were surrounded by 500 very mad Boston citizens. And the 500 citizens were complaining about the taxes. And they surrounded these 14 soldiers, and they kept coming closer and closer, and they were throwing, you know, it was March, and they were throwing snowballs, they were throwing ice, rocks, all sorts of things. But when they were coming closer and closer, they said, go ahead and shoot. Go ahead and shoot. We dare you to. And as they came closer, suddenly shots rang out, and all the mob ran away, leaving 6 dead colonists on the street. were arrested and charged with murder. And the next morning, I was asked to represent them as defense counsel. Now, some people said, well, they asked you because they had asked everybody else. And I don't think that's true. I think, they thought I was going to be a very successful lawyer to defend these people. And I agreed to represent them, even though I knew I would be hated by almost everybody in Boston, including my own clients. My own clients. Or as Abigail put it, you mean your former clients. Abigail sometimes reveals the truth, unfortunately, at the wrong time. And I did this because I did not want these soldiers to receive a kind of mob justice. Just string them up. Because it would remind the rest of the world that Massachusetts hadn't progressed very far since the days 100 years before when we executed Quakers, and we executed Quakers, you can believe that, and we stoned Salem witches. Well, you believe that. So in this case, but the real reason I wanted to do this was I wanted to prove to myself that we lived by the rule of law. And that was very important as a lawyer. And obviously this was a case of self-defense, that the soldiers fired upon the mob because they were afraid that the mob was about to trample them to death. And apparently it really looked like that. And the trial, which took place in October, November of 1770, and they waited 4 to 5 months for the trial to take place because they wanted tempers to cool. And this trial that took place was the first instance in a colonial court where the judge instructed the jury that you cannot convict unless you are convinced of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt? Uh-oh. Is that my, well, whatever. You cannot convict, are you hearing a telephone? No? Okay, it's coming through somewhere. Yeah. Without a reasonable doubt. And, prior to that, the standard of proof for a criminal action was preponderance of the evidence. And they would have these different sort of scales of justice, one or the other, see more guilty or less guilty, and they would determine guilt and innocence by that relativeness. Beyond a reasonable doubt leaves no relativeness. It meant that a juror to convict, the juror must have no reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. And in my argument to the jury, I had to explain to them, why is it that we seem to bend over backwards, as some people would say, to protect the guilty? Why is that in common law we make it so difficult to convict someone? And the reason is, and this is exactly what I said to the jury, the reason is because it's of more importance to the community that innocence be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. More important that innocence be protected than that guilt should be punished. And that's the basis for all due process law from that trial to the present day. It's as simple as that. And in the end, all but 2 of the soldiers were found not guilty. But 2 were found guilty. And I know I've disappointed you. You thought I got them all off, didn't you? But I didn't. And those 2 who were found guilty weren't found guilty of murder. They were found guilty of a much lesser crime called manslaughter, which stood for the proposition that out of weakness, out of incompetence, out of fear, out of, just making mistakes, people fired their weapons without the real desire of killing anyone. And that made it manslaughter, which is a much lesser crime and a much lesser penalty. And the judge said that he was not going to sentence those 2 that day. He was going to wait until the next day because he wanted counsel to be aware of an ancient British rule called benefit of clergy. And I said to myself and my fellow counsel, I'm not aware of that rule at all. What is he talking about? Benefit of clergy. These are not clergymen, these are 2 soldiers. But anyway, the judge adjourned the case for the day. We had to go back the next day and basically argue about the punishment for these 2 soldiers or clergymen. But when a judge gives you, and he clearly looked at me, he gives you a signal what he wants you to do, you better follow it pretty closely. And this judge said, there's something there, and use it. So we went to the library and looked up benefit of clergy. So what does it mean? And we found out that it stood for the proposition that in civil courts where it's not a capital case, and it's not capital anymore because it wasn't murder, it was just manslaughter, the civil courts could not punish the defendant more who could prove he was a clergyman than to brand his thumb. That was it. Rather strange rule. And so when we looked it up further, we found that the reason was that in non-capital cases, you have a clergyman, the clergy are responsible for all sorts of punishments and rules and regulations of their own church, ecclesiastical courts. So the civil court didn't have to get involved. Well, that might have been the reason, but here, what is going? So I said to my co-counsel, we're going to have to talk to those 2 prisoners who were still being held, all the others were let go, and figure out if there's anything we could do. So anyways, we went and visited their cell that evening, and I brought a Bible with me, and I said to them, do either of you know any prayers? And one of them said, oh yes, Mr. Adams, I was an altar boy in England for 6 years, and I served so many ceremonies, especially funerals, that I know the 23rd Psalm by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I said, that's great. You're going to repeat that tomorrow morning to the judge. And then I said to the other prisoner, and what about you? And he said, oh, Mr. Adams, I haven't been to church in my life. So I gave the Bible to the altar boy, and I said, you teach him the 23rd Psalm. And then we left, and we, hoped for the best. And the next morning, everybody in Boston, they could get into that courthouse, and they had the windows open so people could lean in and try to hear what was happening. And it was all filled, and the judge came up, and he said, all right, order. right, before I sentence these two, I want to know, does counsel have anything to add? And I knew I had to say something. So I said, yes, raised in, oh, Mr. Adams. Yes, Your Honor, we want to prove this morning that these two men are actually clergymen. And with that, everybody in the courthouse laughed. They just all laughed. They thought this was a ridiculous thing. And the judge said, silence. All right, first witness. And we got the altar boy up, and he's recited the 23rd Psalm so beautifully. And then we got the fellow who never went to church in his life. And he was on the fourth line, and he was in terrible trouble. Because, you know, not only did he go to church, he didn't go to school either, so he couldn't read what the Bible was saying. So there he is, and the judge said, all right, I have heard enough. I will find that both of these men are clergymen, and they're to be sent out, and their thumbs to be branded, each one, with the letter M for manslaughter. And they went out, the case was over. And there it was. And I thought I did pretty well for a lawyer, you know. There were 6 dead Bostonites, and all the British soldiers got were 4 branded thumbs, which they got better after a few weeks. And I thought, well, I still have the problem. Where am I going to practice law now? Because not only did the people not like me to represent them, but not only did I represent the soldiers, but I got them off. But I soon discovered that the population of Boston was very fair. And they said, if you have a serious crime, you need a serious lawyer to defend you. And that's just the way it should be. And again, this is another icon that comes from the Boston trial that was important. And it also didn't hurt to have, as my cousin, as things were going by, Sam Adams. Now, Sam Adams was sort of in charge of the Sons of Liberty, and they were always playing tricks and doing terrible things to the British and trying to get away with it. And when I was, you know, trying the case for the soldiers, they instructed the Sons of Liberty that they were not going to touch me, or else they were going to get it from Sam Adams, and he was a very big guy. He was 15 years older than I was, by the way. Anyway, some people ask me, you know, what do you think about Sam Adams's brewery? You know, his beer and his ale and all this other stuff. And I said, you know, my favorite alcoholic beverage is hard cider, and he never makes hard cider. So it was something that, you know, he couldn't sell. And, you know, if you go to a store, an alcoholic store, and you ask for Sam Adams hard cider, please, they say, oh no, he doesn't make hard cider. He still doesn't make hard cider. My goodness. So anyways, every morning at breakfast, I have a full tankard of hard cider. And when Abigail brings it to me and she says, oh, John, must you? And I say, Abigail, it's good for my, it's good for my digestion and my disposition, if you know what I mean. You know, in 1774, that was 4 years after this trial, the colonies got together and said, we have to do something about our problem with England's getting worse and worse, and they're trying to do more and more things that are very harmful to us, and we have to meet them as a group. We don't want, the British to just, scare Philadelphia, but not scare Boston. We wanted them, if you're going to do something, we want it as a group, and we will have some chance to think this over and do what should be done. And there were 5 slots open for delegates from Massachusetts, and I was given one of the slots. And I think this showed that the population thought that I was a fair person and a brave person, and that held well for me. And my proudest moment at the Continental Congress, this was 2 years later, was to serve as chairman of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, everyone knows that Thomas Jefferson wrote it, but he was up in the bedroom of this row house that he rented in Philadelphia, and Benjamin Franklin, who was also on this committee, and me, we were downstairs, and as Jefferson was writing away, and it took him a whole week to write the Declaration of Independence, he would send his drafts down through the stairway, and we would catch him, and then we would read it and give him our thoughts. And so many of our thoughts, we said, oh, no, I don't know. But for instance, when Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, amongst them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness. I said, wait, he wrote pursuit of happiness? Happiness is a mere emotion, I said to Franklin. It's not a positive virtue or good. We can't have happiness in the Declaration of Independence unless we define it in the text, I said to Franklin. But Franklin just laughed, the way he always laughed when he disagreed with me. He's a very annoying man. He said, John, let's leave Jefferson's language the way it is, because outside of New England, everyone knows what happiness is. 2 years afterwards, when Franklin and I were now delegates from the Continental Congress in Paris, I discovered that for Franklin, the pursuit of happiness clearly meant the pursuit of women. My wife Abigail would have made a very good president, but of course, women at that time could not only not hold office, but they couldn't even vote. But if she could, I don't think she would ever subject herself to the nasty things that occur to someone who campaigns for the presidency. And that's been marked by all politics right from the beginning. And those of you who think that character assassination and slash and burn tactics are recent creation should study the campaign of 1800, when I ran for re-election for president, and I was opposed by Thomas Jefferson, who was the eventual winner. And one of the critics in that campaign stated that John Adams, and this is something when I say stated, this was published in all of the newspapers up and down the coast. One of my critics says at the campaign that John Adams is mentally deranged and subject to uncontrollable emotional fits and is at times absolutely mad. And you know who the critic was? Alexander Hamilton. You've heard of him. He was a Treasury Secretary and a member of my own Federalist Party, but he was really mad at me because I had just broken his dream. He wanted to be the general of the National Army, and we had formed a National Army a year and a half before because we were afraid that the French were going to invade us. And, but as time went on, our relationship with the French got better. One of the things was that Napoleon Bonaparte was having more troubles with England than he really could handle. So he wasn't thinking about America at all. But you know, it's so. So I when he and what happened was the general of the new army was actually George Washington, sort of in retirement, you know, after he was president. But after George Washington died, Alexander Hamilton said, "This is my chance." So he knocks on my door and he says, "I have to speak to you about filling the generalship of the National Army. I would like to fill it." And I said, "Oh, gee, you're 2 days too late." "What do you mean 2 days too late?" I said, "I just disestablished the National Army 2 days ago because I thought we didn't need it." Oh, he was so mad. Now I'll tell you this, and Thomas Jefferson agreed with me wholeheartedly. If there was anybody in America who resembled and reminded you of Napoleon Bonaparte, it was Alexander Hamilton, and the last thing you'd ever want to do was to give him stewardship of anything military. And well, 4 years after Hamilton wrote this terrible thing about me, he was killed in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. You know, so you people think politics is tough today, but here's the present Vice President killing a Treasury Secretary. So anyway, and you know, people ask me, well, you know, do you still hold it? Well, you know, and there was a big funeral for Alexander Hamilton in New York City, and when I was asked if I attended it, I said no, but I agreed with it. And my political enemies even tried to create a scandal about me. Now, isn't that ridiculous? About me. They said that when I was ambassador to London, my fellow ambassador, Charles Pinckney, had hired 4 mistresses, 2 for him and 2 for me. And when I was asked about that charge, I said, anyone who would think that I would have a mistress, let alone 2 mistresses, had never met Abigail Adams. And charges against Jefferson were just as scurrilous, including charges that he was an atheist. And I knew that was absolutely false because Jefferson and I, in our time when we were together, one of our favorite subjects to discuss was theology. And if you're a theologian of any sort, you're not interested in not believing in God. Now, Abigail could not stand any of this. She used to say, when you hurt him, I am the one who bleeds. And American politics has always been an American blood sport. and especially hard on the Kennedy's family. Now, speaking of presidents, how many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Oh, good. And how many have seen the Washington Monument? Doesn't look anything like him, does it? And how many have seen the Jefferson Memorial? And how many have seen the Adams Monument? That's right, none of you. Because there is no Adams Monument. They skipped right over me. But I don't take it personally. I think it's more of a regional bias by the Virginians against a man from New England. You know, when Gutzon Borglum was carving Mount Rushmore, the portraits of 4 presidents, and I heard about this and I got my hopes up. And then of course I saw, no, still I missed it again. Now here's a little career tip, and who doesn't need a career tip these days? If you want your accomplishments noted and your achievements honored and your memories celebrated, never ever come after George Washington. Simple as that. And you know, I have to confess that I have another love other than Abigail, and that is my love of books. Abigail used to say that the Adamses would be as wealthy as those Southern aristocrats like Madison and Monroe if it weren't for her husband's habit of spending all of our cash on a London book dealer. And you know, at that time we had a private library of 3,000 books. Private library. And the only person that came close, well, he exceeded us, was Thomas Jefferson. And he had a library of 7,500 books. And when my son John Quincy went and looked at colleges and he visited New Haven, and he visited Yale, and I asked him what he thought of Yale, and he said, well, you know, Dad, their library is only half the size of yours. So he went to Harvard. And if I offended any Yale alumni, I want to assure you that I'm sure your library is much bigger now. Now, on March 24, 1800, and during the last year of my presidency, I had the honor of establishing the Library of Congress with an appropriation of $5,000 that was used to purchase 740 books and 30 maps. And all of these were on scientific and government and historical and legal matters. And books were critically important to us because we had no experts on this side of the Atlantic. All the experts were in Europe. And the only way we got their expert opinion was to buy their books and read them. And I want to tell you a story about a young man named Henry Knox. And Henry Knox was 24 years old. He had a bookstore in Boston. And the interesting thing about his bookstore is that for his own taste, he loved everything on artillery science, the science of cannons. How do you build them? How do you aim them? How do you shoot them? How do you do all these things? And he just thought that that was the best thing. And he had 11 books on very serious matters of artillery science. And he studied them very hard, and you know, this is what he did. But when the British took, British came and they occupied Boston 1775, the beginning of the year. And most people just left, and including our bookseller, Henry Knox. He closed out his bookstore and he took most of his books, but he took especially these 11 volumes on artillery science. And what did they do? Where'd you go? All you did is have to cross the Charles River, and then you were amongst the Continental Army. And the Continental Army was made up of militias from the other, well, they weren't states, yes, but the other colonies. And there was frequent battles between them, little things, but there were some major ones. And the biggest one was the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed Hill, where there were 1,000 casualties on both sides. Just amazing. Anyway, so there this was, and there was a stalemate. So the British had the center of this town, and they were surrounded by militias. And this went on for about 9 months. And ultimately, you know, George Washington was made general of the Continental Army, and he replaced John Hancock, who became the president of the Continental Congress. And everyone knew that this, you know, George Washington was the one who was going to win the war. And so he had all sorts of things, and he had inspections. And he brought with him a very talented young man who became his aide-de-camp, and it was a man named Marquis de Lafayette, who was only about 24 years old, but he was brilliant, and he had all sorts of connections and things like that. So during this stalemate that was going on, and now we're talking about, they got into the fall, and later fall, George Washington and Lafayette went to one of the encampments, one of the fortifications that surrounded the British, and they saw something in Roxbury, and they were just astonished. And Lafayette said, "This looks like a fortification that a professional army engineer in Europe would have designed and built." And so Washington went to the people there and said, "Who made this? How'd you get so, who?" And they said, "Oh, there's this big fat kid, he's only 24 years old, he has all these books." And they advised him, he advised them of how to do this. And so George Washington says, "We have to find that," what's his name? Henry Knox. So he says, "Lafayette, write that name down, and we've got to look for this man. He's obviously so talented." And at the same time that George Washington was inspecting this group, Henry Knox had a great idea. And he had an idea of how to throw the British out of Boston. And it was such a good idea, he couldn't tell anybody. He had to save it for George Washington, because if it got out, you know, it wouldn't be as effective. So he went to George Washington's headquarters, which is on Brattle Street in Cambridge. It's now called the, anyway, it's after a poet. And anyway, and so he went to the headquarters, and he knocked on the door, and a guard said, "Yes." And he says, "I want to speak to General Washington." And here's, you know, Henry Knox, he was big, he was very, he was about 6'3", but he weighed way over 300 pounds. And he had no real uniform, and, you know, he just had, you know, a brilliant man, but very slovenly. military sort of look to him. So the guard said, "What do you want?" I want to talk to the general because I want to tell him how to throw the British out of Boston. Oh. Are you in the military? Well, not really. Well, what was your civilian occupation? A bookseller. Guard just shakes his head. I'm sure you can't see the general today, but if you really want to see him, come on Friday when he has a big staff meeting and there's a break like around 11 o'clock. If you come at that time, I'll try to see if I can get the general to speak to you. Okay. So there's Friday, it's 11 o'clock, and the Henry Knox, knocks on the door, and the fellow says, "Oh yes, oh Henry Knox, let me see what I can do." So what does he do? He goes and he finds the meeting that's all going on, and it's a very hot meeting, and he says to the general in a very loud voice, "There's a young man out there, and he's been back several times, but he is very intent on speaking to you because he says he has an idea of how to throw the British out of Boston." He's 24 years old, and with that, his staff, who are about 20 of them, are sitting around. They all laugh. 24-year-old has the idea of how to win the war. And George Washington said, "Why are you laughing? None of you have told me how to throw the British out of Boston. Who is this young man? What's his name?" And the guard says, "Well, let me see. Henry Knox." And with that, Lafayette, who's sitting sort of in the corner there, "Henry Knox, we've been looking for that man for 2 weeks. That's Henry Knox from And George Washington said, "Oh my goodness, well send him in." So Henry Knox walks in, and of course the staff's very skeptical, but of course George Washington and Lafayette, who saw what this man could do in Roxbury, they say, "Okay, Mr. Knox, tell me, how do we get the British out of Boston?" And so Henry Knox says, "Well, in Lake Champlain, at the bottom of Lake Champlain, at the lower end, there's Fort Ticonderoga, which we defeated the British in, and they gave up. But at Fort Ticonderoga, there are still 59 cannon that are there from the British, and no one's moved it one way or the other, and the cannon are the biggest cannon you could ever see. And they're bigger than any of the cannon that the British have in Boston. And if we took those 59 cannon and we moved them 300 miles over the Berkshire Mountains and set them up on Dorchester Heights, which is on the bay, and we aimed them at where the British have their encampment and also where they have their navy, and the British see that, they're going to leave like that. Well, says one of the staff, says, Mr. Knox, it would be something if you came, say, in the middle of summer, and you had this transportation of the cannon in mind. But this is just before winter. There's already in the Berkshires snow and ice. How are you going to move all these cannon in those conditions? You're going to have to wait 6 months. And Henry Knox says, no, sir. The best time to move huge cannons is in the wintertime when there's ice and snow on the ground, and you put them on skids and you slide them on the ice and the snow, and he said, I could move all of them within 5 weeks. So the person says, well, have you ever moved? Have you ever moved cannons anywhere, let alone in the ice and snow? No, I haven't. Well, how do you know this? He says, well, I've read every book on on artillery science. That's what it says. At this point, General Washington decides he has to intervene. He said, all right, Mr. Knox, do you have any of those books you're talking about? Well, yeah, I actually do have one in my knapsack. And he takes out his knapsack and he opens it up in this big volume. And he turns to the page that talks about moving cannons in the wintertime. And he gives it to Washington, and Washington stands before his men. And he turns the page, turns another page, and then closes the book. And he says to his staff, give this young man whatever he needs. And on March 3rd, 1776, which was about 3.5 months, maybe 4 months after this conversation, the British woke up and they looked up on Dorchester Heights, and there were 59 cannons pointing down at them. 59 cannons pointing down at them. And they never even saw the cannons being placed. They never, they just did. And there they were. And one of the generals said, this is the greatest bit of charades and things like this. How did they do this? And we didn't even know about it. So the British tried to elevate their cannons so that they could shoot at these if they decide to. And they realized that the angles were such that they would never be able to shoot up at Dorchester Heights. And so British general called for a truce so they could have a discussion. And the British general said, if you use those cannons to attack our army in Boston or our Navy in the harbor, I will make sure that Boston is burnt to the ground. But if you give me 2 weeks, I'll be out of here with my army and my navy. Wow. Right. So everyone said, yes, except for George Washington. He said, we spent so long, and we did this, no one's ever done anything as logistically grand as what we just did with these 59 cannons. I just can't see just not using them at all. And so people were saying, no, well, how do you know, this and that. At which time, Lafayette runs over to Washington and says, General, I have to talk to you. And they have a little talk. He says, General, there are 59 cannons. However, only 6 are loaded. And we have enough ammunition for 2 more. He says, I think you should take the deal. So George Washington said, oh, well, I'm glad you told me this at this time before I started firing my weapons. But anyway, the deal was made, and on March 17th, 1776, all of the British forces, their men and their navy, left Boston, and they sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. They also took with them 2,000 Tories. These were people, regular citizens, who just said they did not want to live on anything but British rule. And so they left, and that was a terrible time for so many, because these were good people. These were really good people, but they just did not have a loyalty to this new government. And some of them were the attorney who taught John Adams the law in Worcester, and also his co-counsel at the trial of the soldiers. But they were, and so they left. And you know, that day is celebrated in Boston to this time as Evacuation Day. Do any people know that? And it's called, yes, all right, Evacuation Day, and it celebrates the departure of the British troops. And, you know, March 17th, a lot of people get confused. They think it might have something to do with the patron saint of Ireland, but those people don't know what they do. So what happened to Henry Knox? Henry Knox, when he arrived with his 59 cannons on Dorchester Heights, ready to have them installed, was met by George Washington, and George Washington had a special certificate, and the certificate was signed by John Hancock, the President of the Continental Congress, and it made Henry Knox a full colonel. This was a man who wasn't military at all, and all of a sudden he's the full colonel. So Henry Knox was wow. And what else happened to Henry Knox? Well, 6 months later, at the Battle of Trenton, where Henry Knox was instrumental in getting those troops on Christmas Day across the Delaware River to attack the Hessians in Trenton. Because of that, Henry Knox was made a general. And 12 years later, President George Washington gave Henry Knox a new status and commission to making him Secretary of War. So pretty good for a young man who just did nothing but read European books and liberated Boston. You know, it's 1776, in the Continental Congress, where I was, we'd been trying for more than a year to get our fellow delegates to vote for independence from the British Empire. But up to that time, I was completely unsuccessful in all my arguments because there were appeals to the delegates' self-interest, like lower taxes or a better economy or few administrative regulations, because men don't fight and die for such small things. I knew that I had to appeal to that desire in all of us to sacrifice for and towards a goal that was higher than ourselves, and that goal was the formation of a new nation, the formation of America. So instead of arguing the benefits of being free of British domination, I presented in July of 1776 to the delegates of the Continental Congress a much higher goal. And this is exactly what I said. That by a coincidence of circumstances without precedent in world history, we, the 13 colonies, were afforded the unique opportunity of beginning government anew from its foundation and build as we chose a government based upon freedom and liberty. How few of the human race have ever been given the opportunity of planning and implementing an entirely new form of government, not based upon kings or aristocracies or foreign nations, just ourselves. That we are going down a path never traveled before by anyone in history, and that what we did here in founding America would become an inspiration to the entire world. How could we not take advantage of this chance that we have at this moment and at this time to transform the course of Western civilization by voting yes for freedom, yes for liberty, and yes for independence? And ladies and gentlemen, it was that argument that got those 13 colonial clocks to strike in unison in July of 1776, and the nation that we founded in 1776 would go on to have many subsequent American revolutions in every generation, when ordinary citizens like ourselves would join together not in self-interest, but in self-sacrifice to confront new challenges and new perils and make America a better country. So I want to tell you a final story, and this is a story about George Washington. It's the winter of 1777, and George Washington is so fearful that he's going to lose his entire army because their enlistments are up on December 31st. And there, his 12,000 troops were just leaving. And so George Washington addressed the soldiers, numbering about 12,000, in an evening assembly. And there on horseback, and he was with his full general's uniform, Washington told them that he had gotten the Continental Congress to award each one of them, if they would re-up for a year, a special re-enlistment bonus of 1 month's pay. And the pay for a soldier at that time was $10, or equivalent of maybe $4,000. So General Washington told his men at the end of the 6th month, June of 1778, they would each get a $10 bonus, and then he asked that everyone who would re-enlist to please step forward. And no one stepped forward. No one. 12,000 men just stood there. And it was said that the look of shock on Washington's face was apparent to everyone around him. So Washington then turned his horse and galloped away about 100 yards and just stopped. He stopped for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then he rode back to his men and he said these words: "If you will come with me, in the next 6 months, you and I can do more in that period of time than you could if you went home and lived another 50 years, and more than your children's could do, and more than your children's children could do. Because in the next 6 months, we can protect and defend this new nation, the United States of America, who will be a blessing for all your future generations. Now, who will serve with me?" Washington asked. And everyone stepped forward. And everyone stepped forward, and when they did that, each of them knew that Washington was no longer talking about $10. He was talking about their souls and what kind of legacy they could give to their sons and their daughters. Now I'd like to finish this off, a song written by Eugene Shear about America and its legacy of self-sacrifice that has been handed down from generation to generation. And this song was first performed in 2008 by Nora Jones in Ken Burns' documentary on the Second World War, and was later sung by an Air Force sergeant at the dedication of the 9/11 Memorial at the Pentagon. And the song is called America, I Gave My Best to You. Been given by those who came before. The dream of a nation where freedom would endure. The work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What shall our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. America, America, I gave my best to you. Yes.
What religion, when you were going to be in the clergy, what religion was it?
Oh, everyone at that time was Puritan. And Puritan religion, by the way, they changed their name to Congregational. So when you see a Congregational church, that's the old Puritan church. Very, very severe. And by the way, one of the things that got John Adams very much not wanting to become a clergyman was he saw what was happening to clergy, and they had a trial for a clergyman in his house because the clergyman did not believe that people were fated to either go to heaven or hell, which was a belief at the time. Predestination was a belief at the time for the Puritans. Yes? Yeah.
If you're a Tory living in Worcester,
Yeah.
and the British are going to pull out in 2 weeks, how do you find out and get yourself there to join them to go to Halifax?
I think there was a lot of, they were trying to do it.
Telegraph.
But yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was the last train to Boston that you think. I think they were able to get, as long as they got out of town. You know, after Adams and his wife ended their stay, which was for about 3 years in England, where Adams, after the peace and things like that, he was ambassador ambassador to the court of St. James's in London. And after he decided to come home, they decided they should have a real house at home, because the little home that they had in Braintree, it was just a matchbox. And here they were now used to these big houses and palaces almost in London. And so he had his friend look around for a good house, and the friend said, "Oh, I really found this great house." And well, you know, is the person wants to sell it? Oh yeah, he said he really wants to sell it because he's a Tory and he hasn't been living there for 4 years. And that's what happened, you know. So I mean, these people wouldn't lose their property, but they did got. I think they said he's a motivated seller. Okay, let me end with this, and this is I love this thing. It's a blessing that I heard from a college chaplain, and it really says so much to us today. May God give us the grace never to sell ourselves short, the grace to take a great risk for a great good, and the grace to take it, and the wisdom to know that the world is too dangerous for anything but truth, and too small for anything but love. Amen. Thank you very much. Photograph of me and you.
Thank you very much. If I could just have your attention for a couple of minutes, I know you guys want to get outside in the nice weather, but I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon on a wonderful program. Thank you, John. Mr. President. Sorry. Our next program is going to be June 8th at 3 p.m. And I want to just put out a little teaser out there so maybe you can Google this person's name and learn about how the history behind it. But her name was Deborah Sampson. Is anybody familiar who that was? Oh. Well, she was a woman in the Revolutionary War. She disguised herself as a man in order to serve in the army. And it's a fascinating story. She served for 17 months until she was discovered. But again, that's going to be June 8th at 3 p.m.
Who's playing her?
It's going to be a local artist who I really can't disclose at the moment.
Okay.
It's not me. One last thing for history buffs. I know there's a lot of history buffs out here, but we always trying to find a Lunenburg connection to our programs. In the 18th century, Reverend Zabiel Adams, a minister in Lunenburg, was a cousin to John Adams. In case the unlikely event anybody ever asked you that, you'll be able to. Thank you again for coming.